History, they like to say, never repeats itself, but I can tell you after 50 years of reporting, it often echoes with familiar refrains. Take Russia today, for example. It's as if we're back in the old Soviet Union. Once again, we're witnessing the spectacle of a solo dissenting voice, that of 44-year-old activist Aleksei Navalny, who dares to defy the power of a modern police state and to challenge the legitimacy of Russia's new czar, Vladimir Putin. To me, that scenario has an eerily familiar ring. Just like the old communists of old, the Putin apparatchiks played tricks on Navalny. They diverted a plane bringing him back from Germany to a different airport. They swallowed him up in a swarm of police, they carted him off to jail, and then they staged a show trial, a Stalin-type show trial, on the bogus charge that he'd skipped out on a probationary check-in for what had already been a trumped-up and phony case against him. And when thousands upon thousands of Russians all across the 11 time zones of that massive country came out in support of Navalny, just like the communists, the Putin Kremlin denounced them as, quote, hooligans and provocateurs, and then slammed thousands of them in jail. What's remarkable about the Navalny drama is not only his amazing and fantastic recovery from the efforts of the regime to assassinate him with a Soviet-era poison, Novichok, but the ability of this single dissident to rally people all across the political spectrum in Russia with very different points of view, but one thing in common: they oppose Putin and the animal fear that caused in Putin and in the Kremlin. To the Russian people, and particularly to the intelligentsia, this is an age-old epic. They've longingly dreamed of democracy for a couple of centuries, and every generation they see a protest, and it has often sad results. Back in 1820, the young, celebrated poet Aleksandr Pushkin was sent to Siberia by the Tsar for writing and reciting a poem called Ode to Liberty. 3 decades later, the world-famous author Fyodor Dostoyevsky was sentenced to death for anti-government activity, and only at the last minute, with a firing squad already assembled, was he spared by the Tsar. In the 1930s, the poet Osip Mandelshtam was sent to Siberia and those frozen wastes where he died because he wrote a 16-line poem criticizing Stalin, saying the dictator with the cockroach mustache, the wormy fingers, and the executionist's tongue. I experienced some of that myself when I went to the Soviet Union as a correspondent for the New York Times in the 1970s. I met with famous author Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote searing stories about life inside the Gulag Archipelago, the Soviet prison system, and also with decorated Soviet physicist Andrei Sakharov, who was celebrated and then reviled and then exiled by the communist regime there. Sakharov was a strangely mild-mannered intellectual to be such a vigorous and outspoken advocate of free speech and denunciation of the Kremlin repressions. He was tall, slender, cerebral, ethical, idealist. We used to find him outside the Soviet courtrooms standing vigil for the trials of various dissidents and denouncing the Kremlin for their repressions. And then when I would go to his apartment and talk to him and listen to him with his high-minded appeals and watch him sip tea out of a saucer, he'd sip it like this out of a saucer, I would wonder, how did this mild-mannered guy with soft-spoken and tender soul muster the courage to stand up to the KGB and the whole system? For a while, they let him do it because he'd been one of the scientific fathers of the Soviet H-bomb, but eventually the regime got sick of it and they exiled him to the closed city of Gorky. Now, Solzhenitsyn, he was a different kind of story. He was a brawler by instinct, jut-jawed, bearded, barrel-chested. He relished fighting with the state. And he knew the Gulag from the inside. He'd been sent there as a Soviet Red Army officer because he'd written letters to a friend that were critical of Stalin, and they'd been discovered. So he was off in the camps, but Then, when the next Soviet leader came along, Nikita Khrushchev, he wanted to de-Stalinize the system, to liberalize, to open it up. And so he rehabilitated millions of people who had been sent to the camps and repressed by Stalin. And among them was Solzhenitsyn. He was allowed to come back and begin to do his writing. But then Khrushchev's successors went the other way, back in the direction of Stalinism. So by the time I got to the Soviet Union in 1971, Solzhenitsyn was politically radioactive and nowhere to be seen. I saw him a couple of times. The last time was in February 1974, the day before he got arrested. He had just finished writing his massive work, The Gulag Archipelago, the inside story and the anatomy of the whole Soviet labor camp system. And he wanted to alert the West that it was coming. And so he summoned me to his apartment to give me a chunk of it, to write a story in the New York Times and let the West know what was coming. Solzhenitsyn knew that would infuriate the Kremlin bosses, the communist bosses of the Kremlin, and would probably lead to his arrest. And so when I arrived at his apartment, I saw he already had packed his little gulag bag with essentials to help keep him alive in the gulag when they took him back in. And on the way there, I was overwhelmed by the surveillance around his apartment on Gorky Street. Here and there, I would see cars packed with 3, 4, 5 KGB agents, obviously middle-aged men with nothing to do except watch Solzhenitsyn's door. Left me a little chill as I went in, and I'd taken along another correspondent, Eric Damoni of the BBC, who asked Solzhenitsyn after he gave me this piece of writing called There Is No Law in the Soviet Union Today. Damoni wanted him to read some of it. And he started with his baritone voice, and I thought, oh my God, the KGB is going to come crashing through the door and arrest us all while Solzhenitsyn is reading this anti-Soviet stuff. But they didn't. They let us finish. They let us go. But the next morning, 7 KGB agents did come crashing through the door, and they arrested Solzhenitsyn. And the Soviet press said he was being held incommunicado and charged under Article 58 of the old Stalinist constitution, which accused him of treasonous anti-Soviet propaganda. Well, by then, I had already filed my story to the New York Times. I had sent them this chunk that Solzhenitsyn had given me. And I thought, that's prima facie evidence of Article 58. That's the very thing they're charging it with. I'm likely to get arrested too. And in all honesty, I was plain scared. I waited a day. I waited 2 days for the other shoe to drop. And then finally, the Soviet regime surprised everybody. They exiled Solzhenitsyn, but not to Siberia, but to the West. They decided to get rid of him. He was a free man, and thank God, so was I. What's different about the Navalny story from these earlier stories is that he's got social media, he's got the internet to help him, and he and his team make the most of it. They send things that go viral and cause a sensational explosion of popular support. When Navalny denounced Putin as crooked and so corrupt that he built himself a $1 billion castle down in the Crimea, it went up on YouTube, and 100 million people have seen it. When he was making statements denouncing Putin as what he called the poisoner of the underpants, because Navalny says that's where they put the poison that they were using to try to kill him, that went viral too. It activated and mobilized and energized a whole new generation of protesters in Russia. In fact, there are some Russian sociologists who say that 40% of the people who turned out over the last few weeks in Russia to support Navalny had never been in protest before. One academic said, for the first time, Navalny has prompted not only a protest, but he's created a protest movement against Putin. This is historical. But unfortunately, there were others who knew history in a somewhat different way, and they remembered the dark side. One 31-year-old computer analyst told a reporter for the New York Times, the bolts are tightening. Freedom is evaporating, bit by bit, returning back into the old Soviet Union again. Familiar refrain, sad story, resistance, rebellion. Let's watch the outcome.